I just want to say that in the presence of, historians and specialists and practitioners who have worked in a very sustained way, I really do feel as a newcomer. My journey began in 2014, even without realizing it, when Thomas Bremer invited me to his conference in Germany towards the end of the year to reflect on what was happening in the religious situation in Ukraine. And that was actually the topic of the presentation I earlier made in Edmonton. And it had to do with the Crimean Tatars and their responses, their reactions, the way that they met the new challenge and the new situation after the annexation of Crimea. And also, I was curious and delighted to have the opportunity to study the experience of two communities in Donbass. So two communities I had never studied before in Ukraine, and a region which I knew virtually nothing about, but which of course came into the news. And the communities I'm talking about are the Hasidic Jews and the Baptists. So they, at the beginning of these transformations and the conflict, were in the news quite a bit, and there was quite a bit of material. I began to read it and just was literally pulled into that story, and so it's been an exciting thing. The conflict has also been an opportunity for me to do some work on the Orthodox churches. Initially, of course, the Kievan Patriarchate and the Autocephalous Church, now the OCU, and also to meet in Lviv, which I'd been visiting for more than 2 decades, for the first time to walk up, the street and go to the Chancery office of Bishop Filaret, not Metropolitan Filaret, but Bishop Filaret Kucherov, who is of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, and to ask him for an interview as a person who had written to Putin, saying, in 2014, stay out. We're Moscow Patriarch. He's not even an autocephalist, as far as I know, but he feels very strongly about the sovereignty of Ukraine. And I found this very interesting. I later wrote an article about the autocephalists in the UOCMP, but also people like Filaret Kucherov, who recognized that the Maidan was a moment in which something very important was happening in society. At that time, it was still saber-rattling. What would eventually in the summer become the actual conflict was a matter of concern for people who even to this day remain within the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So I met him. I met Metropolitan Alexander Drabinko, and the rest of the team, formerly known as Metropolitan Volodymyr's boys. They were working closely with Metropolitan Sabudan. So that's how I basically got into it. But again, it's a voyage of discovery for me, and I'm still trying to work out a framework. I'm very excited to hear about the kind of studies that are being done in Ukraine. I think it's tremendous work, and I look forward to speaking with people later on. So the first part will be, according to the title as originally proposed, Who's Afraid of the OCU? And it's really connecting a little bit with Anatoly's discussion of the OCU's relationship building or bridge building since the Tomos of Autocephaly, but not with the Greek Catholics, but in the larger Orthodox context. So that's what I'm curious about. And I want to look at 2 concepts in particular, which are appear quite often in the polemics on both sides. The first one being recognition, which is crucial. Of course, they got the autocephaly, but who recognizes it? So recognition is a kind of bone of contention. And then another one that I'm thinking about, I probably need to situate it in some kind of a conceptual framework, has to do with agency. And Heather had proposed, Andrii, maybe you could say a little bit about church-state relations. I actually do that in another paper, but agency is precisely about church-state relations and the question of to what extent are churches, in this case the Russian Orthodox Church or the OUC, free agents in their own countries. To what extent are they dependent on the structure of the state and their political agendas? So I think those are very crucial considerations, recognition and agency. And then what I want to do, as I was, making my notes for this conference, of course, the meeting in Amman took place, and I was again pulled into that because it's of direct relevance. So a number of people have already alluded to it, and I think by now there's a fair sense of information about that. I just wanted perhaps to add a few very skeletal remarks of my own. The OCU's autocephaly may be safely said that has generated far more controversy, at least from where I sit, more controversy abroad than at home. The cries of schism, ecclesiastical annexation, religious persecution, and other allegations of foul play coming from the international scene are often met with bewilderment inside Ukraine, where for decades a massive exodus from the Russian Orthodox Church has been taking place since independence. First to the Greek Catholic, actually before independence, with Gorbachev's liberalization and legalization of the Greek Catholic Church. That was the first departure from Russian Orthodoxy. Then in 1992 to the Kievan Patriarchate, and now since autocephaly to the OCU. As the newly minted church pursues wider recognition, de jure recognition, they want to make it concretized in practice, it has encountered a sustained counter-strategy of non-recognition by Russia and its church. This, of course, complicates its normalization of relations with other Orthodox churches and the achievement of full communion with them. Over the past year since autocephaly, the escalating international commotion has raised the stakes at the very highest levels of orthodoxy, as we've heard, pitting Moscow against Constantinople, and as with the Christianization of Rus Ukraine in the 10th century, on the eve of the Great Schism, the new church, joins a divided international community between Hellenic allies and reluctant Slavic brethren. It seeks a path out of isolation, even as unfolding events appear to be revealing a countervailing geopolitical forces on a historically unprecedented scale. In the course of drafting these reflections on the OCU's pursuit of recognition and relationships, and its most formidable obstacle, which I believe to be geopolitics, a significant meeting of Orthodox representatives took place in Amman, and I'll be making some comments on that. So the first of the two concepts that I'm kind of working with, recognition, and of course it begins with autocephaly. So though disputed at the highest levels, for practical purposes inside Ukraine, autocephaly is a done deal. In terms of the legal formation, in terms of the law of Ukraine, the church is recognized. With all its limitations and divergent canonical interpretations, on the ground it is a fact of life. While not all Orthodox churches internationally are on board, as we have heard again, there is at least partial recognition, and there are allies. The two churches that existed for decades as pariahs, Kievan Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, are no longer shunned unanimously throughout the world as some kind of heretical aliens or fake Christians by the Orthodox world, but they are accepted and recognized as authentic Christians, not just Orthodox, authentic Christians, at least by some. That's a big deal. And we come to recognition. Now, along with autocephaly, even partial recognition, which is currently the case, was sufficient to set off a firestorm between Moscow and Constantinople. The collision between the two patriarchates has been building, of course, for a long time, and we heard this morning about a little bit of the history. I think Thomas was speaking to that. And while the OCU's autocephaly is not the original cause of those tensions, it appears very much to have brought them to a head. The measures taken by Patriarch Bartholomew in support of the OCU are contested, first of all, in themselves. That is, despite his seniority in the community of autocephalous churches, the Patriarch's authority to act as he did, proactively, unilaterally, some would say, is being called into question. Now, in addition to that, the effect or the implications of Bartholomew's actions further appears to aggravate the dispute. And here I'm referring not only to canonical or philosophical considerations, but to existential and pastoral ones as well. Comes back to a point I was previously making. The OCU continues to live in good faith as its constituent parts, the KP and the Autocephalous Church, did before. Nobody of those churches felt that they were not Christian or some kind of schismatics. They were Christian communities. But now they do so, carry on with their affairs, with the blessing of Constantinople. For the OCU and for its members, this recognition is not only a canonical achievement, it is a profound transformation of its life and an affirmation of acceptance by the wider Christian community. On the other side of the dispute, and we're still talking about recognition, the ROC counters with non-recognition. In other words, inside Ukraine, for them, nothing has changed. What used to be two uncanonical churches are now one. The only canonical church for the ROC is the UOCMP. This policy of non-recognition employs, of course, canonical language, canonical justification, but we should not exclude that geopolitical considerations are also at play. So almost simplistic, but I mean, we sometimes focus on the ecclesiastical at the expense of this. There is no sharp distinction that can be sustained, I think, between, on the one hand, Russia's non-recognition of Ukraine's political independence and the project of restoring a Soviet brotherhood of nations, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Russian Orthodox Church's non-recognition of the OCU. They are two sides of the same coin, and any claims that Russian Orthodoxy is being persecuted in Ukraine, I always hear that with trepidation, because I think they have potential to trigger Russia's presumed right to protect its people wherever they may be. Agency, and this will be shorter. The matter of recognition, non-recognition leads to another set of questions which I place under the heading of agency. To what extent are the churches in Russia and Ukraine free agents in their relations with the political order? I think the answer that we give to these questions will have a bearing on the kind of judgments that we make. I sometimes catch myself making judgments about the Russian Orthodox Church, and then I ask, to what extent are they acting freely as a prophetic, creative, authentic Christian church, because it has that freedom to do so, and to what extent is it weighing its words in a place where opposition is suppressed and eliminated? How would another church behave in that kind of a political context? What are the possibilities for speaking out in the name of social justice, fundamental rights, all of the things we like to hear about, against military aggression, for peace, and so forth? If the ROC has no alternative, or any other church for that matter, but to march in lockstep with geopolitical pursuits, and in Ukraine, if the OCU were not to be able to manage to break out of the mindset of wartime kind of rhetoric or mobilization in a way that ends the othering or demonization of all things Russian, it is difficult to imagine any basis for meaningful inter-church dialogue. I was very happy to hear that not everything that we say at the highest level, at the hierarchical level, applies on the ground, although sometimes the hierarchs try to put a stop to this kind of creative agency on the ground. A very curious process is happening there. But if there were at least modest indications of what I call this prophetic agency, then the OCU might be able to take steps toward dialogue. And whatever prospects of dialogue remain, maybe for now, impossible, in the foreseeable future with the Russian Orthodox Church inside Russia. That may not be the case in Ukraine. There may be very interesting points of connection with the affiliate of the Moscow Patriarchate, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, many of whose people know one another, and it's not just Alexander Drabinko and the other metropolitan who came over. I mean, there are contacts on the grassroots level on many occasions. So Amman is the meeting which took place on 26 February. There's a debate about whose initiative it is. For all intents and purposes, the initiator was Patriarch Theophilus of Jerusalem, who visited Moscow in November 2019, met with Patriarch Kirill. They went to the Kremlin and met with someone else, after which Theophilus was given a prize from the Russian Foundation for International Unity of Orthodox Nations and proposed this council in Amman, for which purpose, in his words, to initiate a dialogue on the problems in the Orthodox world at a difficult time. So there they are, making the grand entrance. Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev echoed the idea that there are problems that we need to discuss. There's a danger of a deep schism in the Orthodox Church, referring specifically to Ukraine. And these difficulties can be overcome if we make joint efforts, and there are joint efforts of the universally recognized autocephalous churches. So the problem is in Ukraine will be solved by, of course, the canonical church, but without the OCU having any say in the matter. Of course, the OCU did have its own comments on the meeting in Amman. There was an agreement that the key aim of the Russian Orthodox Church, that it was not Theophilus who was the initiator, that in fact it was Moscow and Kremlin. The whole idea was to squelch, and I use the Russian word, if I translated it correctly, zagovorit, the Ukrainian question. According to Assistant Head of the Department of External Relations, Yevstrati Zorya. And also Risu reported that this was all about raising the issue of the church schism to disrupt the process of recognition of the OCU and challenge the primacy of the ecumenical patriarch. There's a whole discussion, which I will skip over, about who would be participating, because it had to do with the legitimacy and the authoritative power, the normative power of the meeting. And of course, I believe Moscow would have hoped for a much stronger presence. In the end, only 6 representatives of Orthodox churches, 3 of them patriarchs, attended. The official delegation of the Russian Orthodox Church consisted and included Metropolitan Onufrij of Kiev. There was question whether he would participate at all. So in the end, he did participate, but as a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, not as a representative of what he himself, in a speech, would refer to as de facto, not de jure, a de facto autocephalous church. Kirill, briefly at the meeting, reiterated his main concerns. I'll just refer to the first 4 of his 6 concerns. Primacy in the church, so this is about the ecumenical patriarch and his level of authority. Autocephaly in the church, and of course, as we heard before, autocephaly has been discussed in Orthodox fora and for decades that they need to get together and discuss this, but now the pressing issue is Ukraine. So the reference to autocephaly is a reference to Ukraine. Third, the canonical boundaries of autocephalous churches, and of course the canonical territory question. And fourth, the claims of the first among equals, that's the ecumenical patriarchate, and any threats to use those appeals as first among equals to be an instrument of interference in the internal life of local churches. He's referring here specifically to Ukraine. Onufrij, at a press conference after, we're already after the Amman meeting, pointing out that he was hoping for something more to be said. He was hoping that something would be said about this de facto autocephaly, that there was more to it, that Moscow was even though it's too late, to do something, and that didn't come. So he expressed disappointment about that. I have some very interesting comments, and I'll probably end with them, from CYRIL HOVORUN relating to the final document of AMMAN. And he reads this with very meticulous attention, if you know CYRIL, to stylistic, canonical, and historical. For him, the document is restrained and unpretentious. It makes no mention of any schism in the Orthodox world, it doesn't use that word at all, or any break with Constantinople. HOVORUN cannot help but point out, that's what I've been saying all along. No schism. The only reference is to, in the final document of AMMAN, to an impending threat of schism. So Russian Orthodox and Kirill had to pull back a little bit for the consensus document. And that's a far cry from actual schism. HOVORUN takes this as a very positive sign that in the absence of a schism, all forms of communication remain possible, even Eucharistic communion. For the OCU, this is promising. And despite Kirill's repeated objections to the ecumenical patriarch's actions, the AMMAN final document does not question Constantinople's restoration of the Kievan metropolis or the granting of autocephaly to the OCU. It does take issue with the patriarch's position, we've heard about this, that the matter is closed, and instead views autocephaly as an ongoing process that remains to be finalized once there is consensus. I share the view that rumors of a schism have been put aside for the moment, but the discourse of non-recognition continues. Kirill, in his speech at AMMAN, reiterated the main case, as we have seen. UOC MP Metropolitan Onufri referred to its persecution by the state, the OUC MP, in recent years, and it is clear intent of the AMMAN fraternity to meet again later this year, with a view towards growing the opposition to the ecumenical patriarchate and advancing the ROC's claim on Ukraine as its canonical territory. So for the foreseeable future, the ROC may be expected to hold fast to its non-recognition of the UOC as part of the larger agenda not to recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state. Thank you.